"Who had it, Mr. Braden?" I asked him, thinking he'd perhaps tell after all that time. "Never mind, my lad," he answered. "It'll come out yet. Never mind that now. I'll tell you why I wanted to see you. The fact is, I've only been a few hours in England, so to speak, but I'd thought of you and wondered where I could get hold of you. You're the only man of your profession I ever met, you see," he added with a laugh, "and I want a bit of help in that way." "Well, Mr. Braden," I said, "I've retired, but if it's an easy job—" "It's one you can do, easy enough," he said. "It's just this. I met a man in Australia who's extremely anxious to get some news of another man named Falconer Wraye, who hails from Barthorpe in Leicestershire. I promised to make inquiries for him. Now, I have strong reasons why I don't want to go near Barthorpe. Barthorpe has unpleasant memories and associations for me, and I don't want to be seen there. But this thing's got to be personal investigation. Will you go here for me? I'll make it worth your while. All you've got to do," he went on, "is to go there, see the police authorities, town officials, anybody that knows the place, and ask them if they can tell you anything of one Falconer Wraye, who was at one time a small estate agent in Barthorpe, left the place about 17 years ago, maybe 18, and is believed to have recently gone back to the neighbourhood. That's all. Get what information you can and write it to me, care of my bankers in London. Give me a sheet of paper and I'll put down particulars for you." Harker paused at this point and nodded his head at the old bureau which stood in a corner of his room. "The sheet of paper's there," he said. "It's got on it, in his writing, a brief memorandum of what he wanted and the address of his bankers. When he'd given it to me, he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out a purse, in which I could see he was carrying plenty of money. He took out some notes. 'Here's £25 on account, Harker,' he said. 'You might have to spend a bit. Don't be afraid. Plenty more where that comes from. You'll do it soon?' he asked. 'Yes, I'll do it, Mr. Braden,' I answered. 'It'll be a bit of a holiday for me.' 'That's all right,' he said. 'I'm delighted I came across you.' 'Well, you couldn't be more delighted than I was surprised,' I said. 'I never thought to see you in Wrychester. What brought you here, if one may ask? Sightseeing?' He laughed at that, and he pulled out his purse again. 'I'll show you something, a secret,' he said, and he took a bit of folded paper out of his purse. 'What do you make of that?' he asked. 'Can you read Latin?' 'No, except a word or two,' I said, 'but I know a man who can.' 'Ah, never mind,' said he. 'I know enough Latin for this, and it's a secret. However, it won't be a secret long, and you'll hear all about it.' And with that he put the bit of paper in his purse again, and we began talking about other matters, and before long he said he'd promised to have a chat with a gentleman at the Mitre, whom he'd come along with in the train, and away he went, saying he'd see me before he left the town." "Did he say how long he was going to stop here?" asked Bryce. 2 or 3 days, replied Harker. "Did he mention Ransford?" inquired Bryce. "Never," said Harker. "Did he make any reference to his wife and children?" "Not the slightest." "Nor to the hint that his counsel threw out at the trial?" "Never referred to that time except in the way I told you, that he hadn't a penny of the money himself, and that he'd himself refunded it." Bryce meditated a while. He was somewhat puzzled by certain points in the old detective's story, and he saw that there was much more mystery in the Braden affair than he had at first believed. "Well," he asked after a while, "did you see him again?" "Not alive," replied Harker. "I saw him dead, and I held my tongue, and have held it. But something happened that day. After I heard of the accident, I went into the Crown and Cushion Tavern. The fact was, I went to get a taste of whisky, for the news had upset me. And in that long bar of theirs, I saw a man whom I knew for a fact to have been a fellow convict of Brake's, name of Glassdale, forgery. He got the same sentence that Brake got, about the same time, was in the same convict prison with Brake, and he and Brake would be released about the same date. There was no doubt about his identity. I never forget a face, even after 30 years I'd tell one. I saw him in that bar before he saw me, and I took a careful look at him. He, too, like Brake, was very well dressed and very prosperous looking. He turned as he set down his glass and caught sight of me, and he knew me. Mind you, he'd been through my hands in times past, and he instantly moved to a side door and vanished. I went out and looked up and down. He'd gone. I found out afterwards, by a little quiet inquiry, that he'd gone straight to the station, boarded the first train. There was one just giving out to the junction, and left the city. But I can lay hands on him. "You've kept this quiet, too?" asked Bryce. "Just so. I've my own game to play," replied Harker. "This talk with you is part of it. You come in now. I'll tell you why presently. But first, as you know, I went to Barthorpe. For though Brake was dead, I felt I must go, for this reason. I was certain that he wanted that information for himself. The man in Australia was a fiction. I went then, and learned nothing, except that this Falconer Wraye had been, as Brake said, a Barthorpe man years ago. He'd left the town 18 years since. Nobody knew anything about him. So I came home. And now then, Doctor, your turn. What were you after down there at Barthorpe?" Bryce meditated his answer for a good 5 minutes. He had always intended to play the game off his own bat, but he had heard and seen enough since entering Harker's little room to know that he was in company with an intellect which was keener and more subtle than his, and that it would be all to his advantage to go in with the man who had vast and deep experience. And so he made a clean breast of all he had done in the way of investigation, leaving his motive completely aside. "You've got a theory, of course," observed Harker, after listening quietly to all that Bryce could tell. "Naturally you have. You couldn't accumulate all that without getting one." "Well," admitted Bryce, "honestly, I can't say that I have. But I can see what theory there might be. This, that Ransford was the man who deceived Brake, that he ran away with Brake's wife, that she's dead, and that he's brought up the children in ignorance of all that, and therefore—" "And therefore," interrupted Harker with a smile, "that when he and Brake met, as you seem to think they did, Ransford flung Brake through that open doorway, that Collishaw witnessed it, that Ransford found out about Collishaw, and that Collishaw has been poisoned by Ransford, eh?" "That's a theory that seems to be supported by facts," said Bryce. "It's a theory that would doubtless suit men like Mitchington," said the old detective with another smile. "But not me, sir. Mind you, I don't say there isn't something in it. There's doubtless a lot. But the mystery's a lot thicker than just that. And Brake didn't come here to find Ransford. He came because of the secret in that scrap of paper. And as you've got it, Doctor, out with it." Bryce saw no reason for concealment, and producing the scrap of paper, laid it on the table between himself and his host. Harker peered inquisitively at it. "Latin," he said. "You can read it, of course. What does it say?" Bryce repeated a literal translation. "I've found the place," he added. "I found it this morning. Now, what do you suppose this means?" Harker was looking hard at the 2 lines of writing. "That's a big question, Doctor," he answered. "But I'll go so far as to say this. When we found out what it does mean, we shall know a lot more than we know now." End of chapter 14. Read by Anita in Boston in January 2007.